Hello, my AP Econ students. So welcome to AP Macro Unit 2 review. So FYI up front, this video is probably going to be pretty lengthy. I haven't filmed it yet, but I know based on the types of content that I'm covering, the material, it's an entire unit of some pretty big stuff. So I know it's going to be long. So if you look at the bottom of the video or underneath the video as a description, I will list specifically the time frame on the video when each of these things are covered. So if you want to jump to a particular one that you're struggling with, maybe the MPC you got, maybe you want to revisit the Phillips curve or something like that, look for that, and it should show you this is exactly the time where that concept starts, and so you can jump right to that one if you need to. So anyway, these are the things we're going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at a quick refresher on the marginal propensity to consume, or MPC, and give you a quick reminder of the definitions of the three time frames: immediate short run, and long run. Look at the aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph, just again redefine that, give you some of the definitions and the nuances of that. Looking at the classical theory, the whole, if the government does nothing, what happens in the long run, what adjusts, and what brings us back to equilibrium. We'll look at fiscal policy, going along with fiscal policy, automatic stabilizers, and then of course the Phillips curve, which is directly related to all of this. And so let's go through this a step at a time here and see what we got. So the first concept here is what's called the MPC, the marginal propensity to consume. This is very important. A little bit of math involved that could show up with this. So good reminder, there are two things we can do with our money. We can either spend it or not spend it. That's pretty much it. So the question is, how much of our money do we spend versus how much of it do we not spend, or in other words, do we save? Okay. So the averages, that's a thing, the average propensity to consume and save. We're not going to look at that so much though. It doesn't come up as often. What comes up much more often is the marginal, which is the additional amount of any extra money that you make, that you spend. So the question is, if you got a $5,000 raise, how much of that additional $5,000 do you spend? What percent of that? For people that are getting the stimulus check shortly here, it sounds like, the question is, okay, they're getting an additional chunk of money. How much of that additional chunk of money do they spend? That's what we call the marginal. Of course, the additional that you save is called the marginal propensity to save. Okay, but usually you hear the MPC. So the reason this is important is because this factors into what we call the spending multiplier. Remember, the idea is when money is spent, it's not just spent one time. It's spent again, and it gets spent again, and it gets spent again. And so for every dollar spent, you see a multiplier effect where GDP increases by more than that initial spending. So the formula for that is what we call this for the spending multiplier, is usually 1 over 1 minus the MPC. And I say usually because more often than not, they give you the MPC and ask you to calculate. So 1 over 1 minus the MPC. Now, if you're paying attention, that's also the same as 1 over the MPS, because 1 minus the MPC is equal to the MPS. So for example, right here, if the MPC is 0.8, that means the MPS is 0.2. And we're going to see how the problem breaks down here. So to figure out the spending multiplier, 1 over 1 minus the MPC, 1 over 1 divided by 1 minus 0.8, which simplifies to 1 divided by 0.2. And again, 0.2 is the MPS. That's why that formula works as well. And 1 divided by 0.2 equals 5. What that means is that for every dollar spent, it's going to get multiplied 5 times over, and GDP will increase by that much. Okay, so how does this typically show up? The way they like it to show up is this, or the way they often ask it is this. They'll say, all right, we face a $100 billion GDP recessionary gap. In other words, we're in recession and GDP is $100 billion less than what it should be if we're at full employment. So if the MPC is 0.8, then how much does the government have to spend in order to close the gap? Remember, they don't have to spend the entire 100 billion. They can spend a portion of that, and then it gets multiplied and GDP expands by however many times more. So how would we figure this out then? Well, the first thing we want to do is remember, like we did just up here a moment ago, if the MPC is 0.8, that makes the spending multiplier 5. So essentially the government needs to spend 1/5 as much of the recessionary gap in order to boost GDP enough to hit our full employment output. Okay, so 1/5 as much, 1/5 of 100 billion is of course 20 billion. So the idea is pretty simple. The government spends 20 billion, it gets multiplied 5 times over, and GDP increases by the full 100 billion. Okay, so that's a simple problem that they might give you. Here's the gap, here's the MPC, how much has to be spent up front. So first figure out the spending multiplier like we did here, which is 5. If the spending multiplier, say, was 4, they would have had to have spent 1/4 as much as what is there. If the spending multiplier was 10, they would have had to spend 1/10 as much. So it depends on what the spending multiplier is, and then that'll figure out what you have to do. Now, here's where they like to trick you, okay? And they like to make it a little bit more complicated for you. They might ask you this question. What if, instead of spending, what if the government decides to cut taxes? Now, we're going to see in a second that fiscal policy, again, has to do with taxing and spending, so this would relate to fiscal policy things. But the question is, if they cut taxes instead, would they have to cut taxes by the same amount as what we just spent, which was 20 billion? Would they cut taxes by more than the 20 billion or less than the 20 billion? And the answer is always more than. Okay, the idea, and this is important, spending always has a greater impact on GDP than a change in taxes. Now, this is interesting because if you remember about a month ago at the beginning when the coronavirus thing seemed like it was just going to be a blip on the radar, the government was discussing potentially getting rid of, for a short time period of course, payroll taxes. Okay, and in order to say, all right, we want to give people more money, so we're going to get rid of all those when you work, you get money taken out of your paycheck. We're not going to do that. We're going to give you all the money. Now, 2 problems that I think they ran into. Number 1 is that certainly helps all the people that still have a job. What about how many millions of people have lost their jobs because of the coronavirus and sheltering in place and everything else that we're dealing with right now, right? That doesn't really help them. That's a problem. The other problem I think that they didn't publicize, but they also thought to themselves was, all right, well, what if we cut taxes and people don't spend the money? Because you don't know how much money people are going to spend. In other words, spending always has a greater impact than taxes. So the government's going to spend $2 trillion. For the most part, about $250 billion of it are these stimulus checks. $1.75 trillion is going to be direct government spending of some kind. And so that's a more certainty because government spending always has a greater impact on GDP than a change in taxes. So whenever you get a question like this, the simple answer is more than. If they ask you how much more, this gets a little bit more complicated, it gets a little mathy. Good news is this year you're allowed a calculator. So the question is, how much more would they have to spend? The formula I like to use is the spending goal. Okay, now that's important. What are we talking about? What do I mean by saying the spending goal? The spending goal is the amount the government would have spent up front, which up here, as we see, the government wanted to spend 20 billion. So 20 billion, again, the goal is not our GDP gap. Okay, don't get confused by that. The goal is not the $100 billion GDP gap. The spending goal is how much the government wants to spend up front. You simply divide that by the MPC, which in this case was 0.8, and if you do the math, 20 billion spending goal divided by 0.8, that would mean the government should cut taxes by 25 billion. Now, why 25 billion? Because remember, if people spend 4/5 of the additional money they get, what happens to that other 1/5? That's right, they save it. So if you give people $25 billion in the form of a tax cut, they're going to save 1/5 of that. So they're going to save 5 billion. Okay, so in a sense we can subtract that, and that means people will actually spend 20 billion. Okay, and then we get our spending goal. Okay, by saving 1/5 of that, or 5 billion, they actually spend the 20 billion. And again, you can see why the government say, why didn't we just spend 20 billion to begin with? Okay, that would have made it a lot easier instead of going through this and trying to figure out how much people are going to spend and all that kind of stuff. Let's just spend it, and we know it gets spent. All right, so that's the MPC and how that factors into the spending multiplier with some examples. So hopefully that is helpful to you. The next, real quick, as a reminder of the definitions here, and these are important because the wording of the question may trip you up depending on how they say it. So, two things to keep in mind. Okay, we're talking about the short run, immediate short run, and long run are based on when product prices and when input prices can change. So a quick refresher to product and input prices. What I mean by product price, just what it sounds like. This is the price that the business charges for their product. How much does McDonald's charge for a hamburger? How much does Foot Locker charge for a pair of shoes? How much does an airline charge for a seat on a flight, and so forth? And then input prices are the price of the various factors, usually wages. Wages are usually the biggest expense that any business has, but it could also be some of the various resources. Again, if you're making ice cream, you got milk, you got ice cream, you got sugar, you got all these other flavorings and whatever else. So those are input prices. Okay, so just make sure you know what product prices versus what input prices are. Now, how do we define the different time frames? You have the immediate short run. In the immediate short run, there's not enough time to change anything. Okay, both product prices are fixed and input prices are fixed. Now, why are product prices fixed in the immediate short run? Well, because there's partly because there's advertised specials out there. Again, I've used this example before. If Papa John's says all of April, you can get 2 large pizzas for $12. Guess what? All of April, whether everyone's buying their pizzas or nobody's buying their pizzas, 2 large pizzas are going to go for $12. Halfway through the month, if it's wildly popular, they can't say, oh, JK, I know we told you all April this is what it was going to be, but we changed our minds. Okay, so there are some advertised specials. There's also some traditions. I think of, for a long time, McDonald's had the dollar menu, certain things on the dollar menu like McDoubles and McChickens and things like that. And so to take things off of the dollar menu, again, is kind of a movement away from something that people have come to know and expect. And so it takes a long time for them to get to that point where they say, all right, costs are rising. We can't charge $1 for McDouble anymore. It's going to be $1.29, whatever the case may be. All right, so there's some of that as well. And so that's why product prices are fixed. Input prices are fixed because, simply put, there are a lot of contracts. Okay, businesses sign contracts with their employees. Sometimes it's for a year, sometimes it's for multiple years. And whether the company does well or poor during that time frame, the worker is pretty much guaranteed to have that amount. So there's a lot of contracts, not to mention, again, a pizza restaurant. They may sign a contract with a cheese supplier that for the next year or 6 months or whatever the case is, they're going to get cheese from this guy and this is how much they're going to pay for it. And so there's a lot of contracts out there that just take time to expire and get renegotiated and renewed and all that. So that's why you see product prices and input prices fixed in the immediate short run. So bottom line is there's not a lot of adjustment that can take place with price in that time frame. Now, in the short run, and remember, all these time frames are not defined by a specific period of time. You can't say the immediate short run is a day or a week or a month or whatever the case may be. It's however long it takes for product prices to become flexible. For some types of businesses, that could be almost minute by minute. For other businesses, it could be weeks or months. It just depends entirely on the business. But the short run is now where there is enough time for the to change the product price. It should produce price. It should say product price. Change that on my study guide. To change the product price, but there's still not enough time to change input prices. In other words, wages and other resources, those contracts are still in play and they're still fixed. Okay, so that's the short run. Product price can change. If everybody's getting pizzas, you have time to change the price of your pizza, but you're paying your workers the same amount. You're paying the same amount for your cheese or for your dough or sauce or whatever else. Rent, things like that, insurance. All right, in the long run, it all becomes flexible. Okay, long run, well, again, how long is that? It depends entirely on how long it takes to be able to change those input prices. For some companies that sign 3-year contracts with their employees, the long run is 3 years. Like LCA, we teachers sign a 1-year contract. So next year when they offer us contracts, they can either give us more money if the school did well that year, maybe give us less money if the school don't do so well and so forth. But throughout the course of a year, they sign a contract. They're pretty much legally obligated to pay us teachers whatever they promised to pay us during that time. Okay, so that's the long run. Everything is flexible. Okay, so good reminder on those definitions. Now, let's look at our beloved aggregate supply, aggregate demand graph. We've got to know it so well. And so remember the difference between this and a typical supply and demand graph like we did in micro. Again, we've got, instead of just supply and demand, we're talking about the supply and demand for all American products or whatever nation you're talking about. And so you've got aggregate demand. Aggregate just means the total demand for all American products. Short run aggregate supply, again, based on those definitions we did a moment ago, the aggregate supply in the short run for all American products. Long run aggregate supply, and I'll remind you of what that represents in just a moment. And then, of course, because we're talking about all the prices in the economy, which at any given time, some prices might be going up. So think about right now, certain prices like the price for necessary materials, medical supplies, hospital masks, gloves, things like that, hand sanitizer, those things are going up. Gas prices, I just bought gas today for $1.28. Okay, so some prices are going up, some prices are going down. So we generalize and say price level, which is kind of a generalization for inflation or deflation, which we talked about with the CPI and all that. And then instead of just a quantity, it's the total quantity of everything produced. What is that? Of course, that's our GDP, our real GDP. We're going to adjust for inflation. So, and then of course, wherever SRAS and AD intersect, that's always our equilibrium. Remember, LRAS is in a sense where we should be, and I put should in quotation marks, that's going to be our full employment output, but we are producing at any given time where the SRAS and the AD intersect. Doesn't really matter where the LRAS. LRAS doesn't tell us where we are. It just in a sense says this is where we should be. Okay, where we are is where SRAS and AD intersect. All right, what things could cause aggregate demand to shift? Okay, 4 things. Any change in consumption, any change in people's willingness or desire to buy things or not buy things. Number 2, any change in investment spending, specifically. Are businesses building new factories? Are they putting more money in research and development? Are they expanding in that way? Any change in government spending? Remember, the government's a player in the economy, like everybody else, and so pretty big player. They spend trillions every year, so whether they spend more or less, that's going to influence the economy. Are they building more roads and highways, expanding national defense, and so forth? And then, of course, a change in net exports. How much, remember, demand does not just measure how much Americans want to buy our goods, but how much everybody in the world wants to buy our goods. Okay, so any change in net exports. Now, that should look familiar, because these 4 things also represent what? That's right, very good. The things that encompass GDP. Those are the 4, CI, G, and X, or XN. Those are the 4 things that encompass GDP. So naturally, a change in any one of these 4 is going to change the demand for the things that we are producing, ergo GDP. Okay, again, if there's an increase in any of these, aggregate demand increases. If it's a decrease in any of these, aggregate demand shifts left. The primary shifter of SRAS is any change in input prices. Okay, this is kind of the same thing we learned with supply when we learned it in micro. Remember, if your input prices go up, whether you're talking about the price of workers or the price of resources, that's typically going to cause supply to decrease or shift left. Okay, if the price of input prices goes down, that increases your ability to produce. And so it's cheaper to produce, you can make more, so SRAS shifts right. And then lastly, what does the LRAS represent? Very important, full employment output, in a sense. And remember when we talked about employment, full employment does not mean a 0% unemployment rate. It means we only have frictional and structural. It just means that we don't have any cyclical. So again, it's not 0%, it could be 4%, 5%, 6%, 3%, whatever. It just means that we only have those types, frictional and structural. And essentially, what this represents is, okay, if we were generally working at full capacity, minus those natural types of unemployment, how many goods and services could we produce? If generally everyone who wants a job has a job for the most part, how much can we produce? And it's going to be whatever quantity that is. Again, that doesn't tell us where we are, it just kind of says where we should be. All right, now, that's not to say that it can't move. Okay, if the LRAS shifts right, that indicates that our economy is growing. Again, think of after the Industrial Revolution or after the Technological Revolution. Using the same number of workers and resources, we can make more things because we found better ways and more technologically advanced ways of making things. So that LRAS could shift to the right, and that would certainly indicate that now, again, at full employment, we can make more than we did before. It could also shift left. Now, we don't like it to shift left, but it could shift left, and that would indicate that at full employment, we can't make as much. This tends to happen especially after, say, natural disasters or war. You know, think of after World War II, how much of Europe had been bombed and destroyed because of the war. That significantly, not to mention all the people that were lost, workers, right? So at full employment, they were not able to make as much after the war as they were before the war. Okay, and so that lagged. Of course, that's going to grow as technology grows and population grows and everything, but in the short run, that shifted to the left. So we don't like it to shift left, but it can under some dire circumstances. Okay, so just kind of the main nuances. For the most part, it's a supply and demand graph. Again, we just add this little wrinkle, this long run, indicating that that's full employment. All right, now let's talk about the classical theory of macroeconomic equilibrium. The idea here, and I'm going to talk about, there's two. Of course, one is where there's an inflationary gap and one where there's a recessionary gap. And the question is, what changes take place in the economy and how if the government does nothing? And that's the key. The classical approach, sometimes called the conservative approach or the laissez-faire approach, it's the idea that you just let the economy be, let it adjust itself, let it fix itself, and we're going to see how this process works. Okay, so in an inflationary gap, remember, LRAS represents, in a sense, full employment output. An inflationary gap means that we are beyond full employment. Okay, we are in expansion. We are making more than we would normally or naturally make under normal market conditions. And as you can see here, the intersection of the SRAS and AD, which always indicates where we are producing, is greater than full employment. Okay? Now, what's going to happen? Remember, in the short run, because product prices can change, but input prices can't, it means that in the short run, businesses are going to be making a lot of money. Okay? You're getting more for your product, but your costs have stayed the same, extra profit. Okay? That extra profit, again, is a signal that the market is sending businesses saying, hey, good job, produce more. Now, here's the thing. As businesses produce more, of course, you need more workers. Okay, so in order to produce more, you're going to have to work extra shifts. Your workers are going to work overtime. They're going to work nights, weekends, whatever else. Now, the thing is that can only last for so long. When those input prices become flexible, when those contracts run out, and workers say, look, you've been working me like a dog over the last 6 months or year or whatever else, I want more money. So as those input prices become flexible, eventually they're going to start to raise as workers demand more money and these contracts run out and the prices go up. Remember what we talked about a moment ago with SRAS. When input prices increase, what does that do? It causes SRAS to decrease. Okay, and so the idea here, the process, and again, if they asked you to explain this on the test, you'd have to use all parts of these to make sure you get the answer in the long run. Now, why do we say long run? Because it takes the long run for these input prices to become flexible. So in the long run, wages and input prices, like we said, are going to start to go up. Now, if wages go up, generally speaking, businesses hire fewer people, or they cut back on hours, or they get rid of that weekend shift, or whatever else. And as they hire fewer workers, they are going to make fewer things. Making fewer things means that SRAS shifts to the left, like I showed up here, and it brings us back to our full employment output right here. Okay, now notice from the beginning, wherever that was, we don't know what shifted to put us in expansion, but from here to here anyway, we notice that inflation went up. Again, in the long run, we kind of say, money doesn't matter so much, prices don't matter so much. Okay, the only thing that really matters is the fact that we're coming back to that full employment output. So yes, prices went up, but remember what happened to worker wages? They also went up. And so it kind of balances out in the long run. Wages or prices aren't as important as they are in the short run per se. Okay, so that's one possibility. and that's what we call our inflationary gap. Now, if we are experiencing a recessionary gap, okay, again, what's the classic? Again, classical, government's keeping their hands off. They're just letting things adjust on their own. So a recessionary gap means that we are in recession. We should be here, but we're not here. We're to the left or less than full employment output, okay? So we're going to assume that there's some unemployment. If we're making fewer things, we don't need as many workers. So unemployment's probably going up. Obviously, this is what's happening right now. We're in recession. And so unemployment goes up. Again, in the long run, why the long run? Because it takes the long run for wages to become flexible and all that. But in the long run, wages and input prices are going to start to come down. As workers become desperate, eventually they'll start working for anything, right? If they haven't had a job in a long time, and that additional competition among workers who are out of work drives wages and other input prices down. As those wages and prices start to come down, what does that do? Well, that increases or shifts SRAS to the right. Because remember, if wages are cheaper, that means that you can hire more workers. Okay, businesses are going to hire more workers, or input prices become cheaper. They are able to make more things. And as they make more things, that shifts the supply curve, the SRAS, to the right and brings us back to the LRAS. And again, in this case, you would say from where we started to where we ended, prices went down, but you'd say, it doesn't matter so much. Yes, prices went down, but worker wages went down too. But in theory, it kind of all, prices are 10% lower, but your paycheck is 10% less. So it kind of balances out, and that's kind of where you say, it doesn't really matter so much in the long run. Okay, so that's the classical theory of what happens in a recessionary gap. And remember, all these parts are important. Wages and input prices decreasing, businesses hire more people, now they can make more things, and that's why supply shifts to the right. They're making more things. All right, so that's the classical approach. Now, we also know there's another side of that coin, and that's sometimes called the Keynesian approach. This is where the government says, let's get involved. Okay, let's not just sit back and wait for things to adjust, but let's be active in the economy and hold the steering wheel and help fix these fluctuations, these market gyrations. And that's fiscal policy. First of all, remember what fiscal policy refers to, and the next time we do a review, it'll be on monetary policy, two very different animals. Okay, so make sure you know the difference between the two. Fiscal policy, we're talking about the government. The government, we're talking about the government, specifically mean the president and Congress. Their use of taxing and spending to influence the economy. Okay, so their use of taxing and spending to influence the economy. Now, how do they do this? Well, typical Keynesian philosophy or fiscal policy approach. If we're in a recession, again, what does the government want to do? They want to spend more and or, okay, it says and, it really should say and or, tax less. Okay, they want to either spend more and or tax less. The goal of that is to increase aggregate demand in the economy. Okay, and we're going to see this in a second with the graphs. In expansion, now again, you might say, well, why are we concerned about expansion? I thought we liked expansion. Yes, we do. The one problem we can run into with expansion is sometimes inflation. These bubbles, they kind of get out of control, and prices start going up too high. The stock market gets too inflated, or the housing market like we had in the early 2000s, and that causes inflation to go up. And so expansion in and of itself, the government is mind, of course, but if they're concerned about the inflation, they might be. And so in expansion, they will do the opposite, of course, spend less and tax more. The goal there is to decrease aggregate demand in the economy, to kind of chill the economy out a little bit, okay, kind of bring it back to back down to earth. And so remember, why are these changing aggregate demand? Well, one, because you're talking about either government spending, and that was one of our AD shifters, right, government spending, or when you talk about taxes, right, that's going to affect consumption. Could in fact investment as well, depending on what they tax and all that kind of stuff. So those are AD shifters. Those are things that are going to shift aggregate demand. So what does this look like in practice? Okay, my expansionary policy, and when I say expansionary, I mean we are in a recession and the government's trying to give the economy a goose. Okay, so if you notice where we start here with AD1 and SRAS, remember we always produce where AD and SRAS intersect. LRAS is just where we should be. It doesn't tell us anything about where we actually are. But as we start out here, originally, we are less than full employment. That's a recession. Okay, so just to make that clear, we're talking about a recession. So expansionary policies, we're trying to give GDP a goose here by either spending more or taxing less. That's going to boost aggregate demand. I just threw my marker, that's fun, and bring us back to equilibrium, okay? In the opposite, one moment while I retrieve my marker. That was fun, okay. In the opposite, when contractionary, again, is when we're in expansion, okay? And again, we might be concerned about inflation, especially. So what do? They either spend less or tax more by either not spending as much, or taking more money out of people's pockets. People can't spend as much. That's going to affect government spending and or consumption, and that's going to shift AD to the left. Again, where did we start? We started here beyond full employment. That's why we call it expansion. Shift AD to the left, and now that brings us back to where we should be, our LRAS. Okay, so that's your typical fiscal policy approach to the economy, how the government's going to steer the economy. Think of what the government's doing right now with the big stimulus package, all that kind of stuff. What are they trying to do? They're trying to boost aggregate demand, because certainly aggregate demand is declining as people are out of work, this and that. I would say we've also seen probably a supply shift as a lot of businesses have shut down, so it's kind of a double whammy right now. If you go back up to, for example, our LRAS. So what's happened? People are out of work. People are freaking out, so they're probably not spending on the things they normally spend on, vacations and other frivolous things, whatever. And so as people are out of work and they're not spending, it shifts aggregate demand, because some businesses have shut down entirely, others are operating at a lower than normal capacity. That also shifts SRAS. So why do we have such a mess on our hands? Because really we've seen a decline in AD and our SRAS. It takes us that much further out away from our full employment output. So this is a kind of unprecedented, rare circumstance where we're seeing two things decline significantly, okay, at the same time, bringing us into a very big problem, okay, far away from long run. All right, let's talk about automatic stabilizers. So remember everything I just told you about fiscal policy. Well, we've got a system set up in place that kind of automatically, and that's the key word there, that's why it's underlined, puts into place the policies that we just described without special government action. Now, what the government's been doing with the stimulus package and expanding unemployment benefits and this and that is not automatic. That is taken as special action by the government, okay? Passing bills through Congress, spending bills, and then getting signed by the president and this and that. That's not automatic. Automatic are things that require no special action by the government. So examples, in recession. Well, in recession what happens? People are out of work. If people are out of work, they're making less money. So more people are going to qualify for unemployment and welfare type programs like housing allowances and food stamps and things along those lines. And so you're going to see an automatic boost in government spending, okay, during a time like that. What about with taxes? Well, remember we pay taxes based on income. In a recession, not as many people are working. Or if you are working, maybe you've gotten cutbacks, you know, your bonuses got taken away this year, or fewer hours or whatever else. Well, if people pay based on income and people are making less income, that means they're going to pay less in taxes. It's kind of an automatic tax cut during a recession. What about an expansion? Well, in expansion, it's the exact opposite. Of course, more people are going to tend to be working during times of expansion. If more people are working and people are making more money, fewer people are going to qualify for unemployment and welfare type programs and such, and so it's going to be an automatic spending decrease. Okay, those things are not going to kick in and they're not going to get spent on. And then, of course, as far as taxes are concerned, as we're in expansion and people are working and making more money, they pay more money in taxes. So it's an automatic tax increase in a sense. And so the key there is that these things happen automatically. The government doesn't need to go and meet and pass bills and all kind of stuff. These programs are in place, and so they happen automatically. That's why they're automatic stabilizers. All right, last concept. We got the Phillips curve, one of our favorite concepts. All right, so what is the Phillips curve doing for us? It is measuring the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Okay, now here's how we do the trade-off. In the short run, okay, and that's key, in the short run, we assume that there is an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. In other words, one goes up, the other one goes down, and vice versa. Okay, now why do we say in the short run? Well, as we're going to see in a second here, any change in aggregate demand causes us to move along the short-run Phillips curve, which demonstrates this short-run trade-off. So it should make sense. Think about it. If aggregate demand increases and people are spending more money, typically there's more money out there in the economy. If they're buying more things, more people are going to be hired, and so we're going to see inflation go up because aggregate demand increases, but we're going to see unemployment come down. In reverse, if aggregate demand decreases, okay, people aren't spending, you're going to start seeing things get cheaper because things go on sale when people don't buy them. So inflation is going to come down, but then if people stop buying, businesses stop making, and unemployment goes up. So in the short run, when aggregate demand shifts, there tends to be an inverse relationship with the two. What did we learn a moment ago, though? In the long run, remember, typically it's supply that shifts. And we're going to see in a second here, when supply shifts, it does not follow this neat and tidy inverse relationship. We'd say there is no relationship in the long run, and that's because changes in SRAS, which occur in the long run, bring us back to full employment. And remember, we showed a moment ago, and I'll remind you this real quick, I think right here. So remember, from here to here, okay, what happens to prices? Prices go up. I'm sorry, showing the wrong one. In classical theory, with the recession, okay, what happened to prices? Prices came down, but unemployment went down as well. And then here in expansion, because supply shifts left, it causes prices to go up, okay, but unemployment also goes up in a sense because we shift to the left there. So in that case, when supply shifts, it takes us off the curve, or you could say supply shifts do not fit the Phillips curve, okay, because they go in more of a direct relationship. And again, it's kind of what I'm saying and when I said that, like, in the long run, prices don't really matter. Prices may go up, prices may go down. What matters is we come back to this full employment output. And that's kind of what the long-run Phillips curve is trying to show us. And so if we look at the graph here, and here's what the long-run Phillips curve and short-run Phillips curve look like. Okay, remember, short run, downward sloping, indicating that if inflation is high, unemployment is low. And as inflation drops, we start to see unemployment go up, so that the short-run Phillips curve indicates this short-run trade-off. The long-run Phillips curve, remember, is really the same thing as the long-run aggregate supply curve. It measures full employment, or the natural rate of unemployment. So in a sense, that's where we should be, and as we saw a moment ago, we always kind of come back there. So this graphic I found works pretty good because it kind of shows the shift from one to another. So this is our ASAD graph right here. Remember, you can always figure out what's happening with the Phillips curve if you look at the ASAD graph. That's the key. So notice here we start at point A, okay? And if we're on the LRAS in the market graph and the ASAD graph, we have to be on the LRPC in our Phillips curve graph because they're measuring the same thing. Full employment output. This is full employment output. This is full employment, but it's really the same thing. It's measuring full employment. Now, notice here, in our ASAD graph, we see an increase in aggregate demand, and that moves us from point A to point B. Again, two things I want you to notice. Number one, what happens to unemployment? Well, we're making more things. We go into expansion. If we make more things, we need more workers. If we need more workers, unemployment goes down. Okay, unemployment goes down because more people are working. We're in expansion. Notice, though, what happened to prices. From A to B, prices or inflation go up. Okay, so if we start at A here, what did I say happened? Unemployment went down. So we go from A somewhere over to here because unemployment's going down. But what happens to inflation? It goes up. And so we move leftward along the curve from point A to point B. Again, this demonstrates how aggregate demand shifts give us an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. Okay, so we stay on the curve because AD shifted. AD shifts keep us on the curve. What happens in the long run? We talked about this a moment ago. We are now in expansion. Eventually, worker wages are going to go up. Businesses are going to hire fewer workers, and that's going to shift SRAS to the left. Okay, and bring us back to full employment output now, and what we call letter C here. Now, there's two ways of looking at this. Number one, if we're at point C here, which is on our LRAS, somehow here on the Phillips curve, we have to be back on the LRPC because they're measuring the same thing, full employment. Okay? Now, how do we know we go this way? Well, notice from B to C, what happens. First of all, inflation goes up even more. From point B to point C, inflation goes up even more. But what happens to unemployment? Well, as we start making fewer things, people are going to get laid off or get hours cut back, and so unemployment goes up. So again, from B to C, inflation goes up and unemployment goes up because shifts in SRAS do not fit the Phillips curve model, the short run Phillips curve. So what happened from point B? Inflation goes up, unemployment goes up, and that moves us to point C. It moves us back to the original or the LRPC, which represents full employment, and that makes sense because we're on our LRAS over here. So that all lines up and it works. And then, of course, the last point that I like to make right here, very important, anytime you have a new point that has gone off the original SRPC, like we have at point C here, what do? We always draw a new curve through it. And that represents a new short-run relationship. In other words, if we start at point C and aggregate demand either increased or decreased, we would move along the new SRPC curve. Okay, so anytime you have a new point that is off the original curve, draw a new curve right through it. And that way, if they ask you, okay, in the long run, what's going to happen to the short run Phillips curve, you can say it's going to move rightward, or you can say it's going to move outward. Okay, those would be the best ways of phrasing that. Okay, it's going to move rightward or outward in order to get to that point. Okay, so that's the Phillips curve. If it was the opposite, if it was a decrease in aggregate demand, we would move to the right along the Phillips curve. That point would eventually migrate back over here, and we'd have a new curve that has shifted left. Okay, so you can work that out on your own, but it's kind of the same concept or process, just in reverse. Okay, so that's the Phillips curve. All right, so that's all of Unit 2 stuff. Again, hopefully that helps you guys. Like I said, as always, if you need anything, let me know. But till next time, stay safe and stay happy.